Crystal Williams, Double Helix, after Jacob Lawrence's The Migration series and Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. 1. At night, my father played piano and sang, his voice our raft on a quiet lake, an island of gentleness. And because gentleness is a choice, I know something, I have told you something essential about my father and the history of Black people in America. And because he looked at my mother and me as if we were divine, brilliant, bright children of God. And because if gesture and spirit have weight, my father's equaled 2,000 blooming peonies, I have told you something about faith and the history of Black people in America. Scientists are full of news these days. We are rotting fruit laid to ground. In each breath we inhale thousands of humans, collected on the tongues of leaves, in the pink eyes of peonies, on the powdery backs of pollen. Exhaled. With each draw, a millennia of history enters us, and we cannot control, can only harness whom or what we host. Our traumas, the bright blue mysticisms and burnt orange murmurs, our joys and muddled currencies are archived in genetic code. I am not of my father's blood, but am of my father, which is also the history of Black people in America. At my 6th birthday party, the parents drank martinis and sangria and white linen and silk as we played on the slip and slide while the desolate beast next door snarled and snapped through the fence, our jubilation magnifying his rage. He leapt and whipped into an ever-reddening frenzy, and because pain will out, and because hatred will out, and because my father sensed a shift in the air, because he deeply believed my mother and me divine, and the faithful have second sight, and because some Alabama-born malice had taught him a lesson to do with mercilessness, the way danger wets the wind, my father tore into the house, emerging with a finger on a gun's trigger. He stood sentinel the rest of the day, gun slack on his thigh, squinting at the feverishness at the fence as we leapt and shrieked and ate cake. This is what I was trying to explain to Avi when I sent him that book about Black migration from the American South. I was trying to say, we have cause to care for and track our wounds. To be anything other than enraged or dead is to be a success if Black in America. To become a refuge, a safe harbor, is to be a miracle if Black in America. His ailing father listened quietly as Avi read aloud passages about the vicious hand of the South, and burnings and bodies and swinging cold chicken and packed trains, escapees casting towards a northern brink they could not fully understand. Away from an ending, they did. And because hatred will out, and because we cannot control whom or what we host, and because his father is a Holocaust survivor, in a moment of lucidity, he said sadly, "Son, why do you insist on reading me my story?" So we, the Jewish son, the African daughter, mouths bursting and soured with flowers and fauna, rotting leaves and peonies, and men banging on the midnight door, stood as an ecosystem of gas and fire, double helixes and light, the story of, the choices of our fathers knotted between us. And because I wanted to touch his face as my own, and because I felt his skin shudder as my own, understood his father's stubble as my own, and because what are we if not our brothers? And because there has always been binding and burning and escaping and enduring, and because I know no better way to understand the history of human beings than to tell you the story of my father's choice to be a raft on a lake, which, no matter what more you might be told, is the true story of Black thought, Black life, Black people in America. 2. At night, my father sang, his voice our raft on a quiet lake, an island of gentleness. And because gentleness is a choice, and because in each breath we inhale thousands of humans on the powdery backs of pollen, I have told you something essential. And because he looked at my mother and me as if we were divine, and because we were really only rotting fruit, lain to ground. And because if gesture and spirit have weight, my father's equaled 2,000 blooming peonies. At my 6th birthday party, the beast next door snarled and snapped through the fence. And because our mysticisms and currencies are archived genetic code, and because pain will out, and because hatred outs, and because some Alabama-born malice had taught him mercilessness, my father emerged from the house, a gun's trigger. And the rest of the day stood as if a refuge, a harbor. The feverishness at the fence, staring at it as we leapt and shrieked. And then Avi read passages from the book. And because we cannot control whom or what we host, and because Avi's father is a Holocaust survivor, he asked, "Son, why?" And because we stood as an ecosystem of double helixes, Alabama and Holocaust knotted between us. And because I wanted to touch his face as my own, as if we were divine, brilliant, bright children of God. And because I felt his skin shudder as my own, as if we were divine, brilliant, bright children of God. Understood his father's stubble as my own. And because what are we? And because there has always been binding and escaping and enduring, and because I am not of my father's blood, but am of Avi's father, I know no better way to explain the history of humans than to tell you my father played piano at night and sang, his voice our raft on a quiet lake, an island of gentleness, and gentleness is a choice, is a miracle in America.